Hi everyone, and welcome to my splitting video. For today's demonstration, I'm going to be using a basic pair of snips, a pair of Felco 2s, and my handy little mini sharpener. Both of these are available on our website, and these are probably the most used pair of snips I use for dividing. So they're pretty good unless you can afford these, but personally I find that these can be a little bit tricky getting into the grooves, so it's just what you find works for your preference. So they're the basic tools that you'll need for dividing, and today I'm going to be showing you how to divide a big clump, because often that can be the hardest to know where to start. And this variety is Siska. So when you dig, there can be many different types of tubers, and this one here can be much easier to divide. So I'll use this one as my example before we get to the hard one. And so the basic terms of when you're dividing is, this is the tuber here, this is the neck, and this part here, this little ridge, is called the crown. And that little ridge right here is where the new eyes will form. So the most important part when dividing tubers is you need to have a decent section of this crown attached to your tuber. And if they have broken or snapped necks, or there any rot, you make sure you chop off any rot. We chop off any broken tails at the end. And this part here is the tail of the tuber. So we trim off any broken tails, we trim off any broken necks, and then we get started. So this one here would be actually quite simple to divide. We find that if you've freshly dug them, the eyes are quite apparent, so you can actually see them, and then they start to disappear for a while, and then they'll go dormant, and then they'll start to show themselves come closer to springtime. So you can either choose to divide them after you've dug them and then store them, or you can choose to divide them right before planting time. So it's all up to your preference. This one here, I don't think has any eyes. It's easy to show. You can kind of see a little bump here, which is where an eye is going to form, but it's not a specific looking eye. So, where would you start on a clump like this? To start with, I like to sharpen my snips. And it's pretty easy to do that. There you go, and it's done. So I'll usually trim down the stems. And then I will look for any broken. And if there's really, really thin ones, those won't store well, so I can sometimes chop them off. Siska can make very large clumps, so that's why I picked that, because I figured going with something big would be a good example than a little small clump. So this one is kind of already split into two, but if it was just one, I would find a vantage point in the center of the clump and chop here. But because this one's already split into two, I'm just going to simply stick my snips in and divide it into 2. Often you can lose some tubers in this process, but it's better to get it separated than to not have it separated. And it can just be a little bit of work, and then you flip it over, and then you just pull apart. See, I really only lost 1 tuber in there. But if you lose a couple or you chop a couple in half, doesn't really matter. And I'm going to put my gloves on here. Personally, I prefer dividing tubers with gloves, but it's all, once again, personal preference. So I will often divide it down into chunks because I just find that works better for my style of dividing, and then separate them into the smaller little chunks. Because there was almost a third little clump in here. Because you can kind of just wiggle them apart. I've done another little section here and pull off any like little root stuff. There's a broken tuber there. Chop that one off. So I'm going to go with dividing this main clump here, because I think that one's a pretty good example. So here we've got some little tiny eyes you can just see. I think they're going to be purple on this variety. Sometimes they're white, sometimes they're purple. So you can see the well-defined ridge where the tuber joins the crown. You need to leave a decent amount of that attached to each. So you can see a little eye here, and so if you can see the eyes, you need to make sure you have at least an eye for each tuber. We work towards that. If a tuber is thinner than approximately 1 to 2 AA batteries, then it's probably going to be too small and we don't keep it. We also look for what we call the mother tuber, which is the one that was originally planted. It's usually the most ugly tuber. It is the thickest skinned, and if there's going to be one rotting in your clump, that'll be the one that's rotting. You can replant them, but they're the most tendency to rot, so we will keep them for ourselves, or if they're really not great looking, we'll just throw them out, unless it's a variety we're really running short of. So my first step is I'll usually go around. I will trim off any broken ends and just clean up the clump, just because I like to see, I find it gives me more of a better view of where I'm dividing in, and I can be sometimes a little bit pedantic when I'm dividing, but that's just me, I suppose. You'll find your own way of doing it, and that's completely up to you. So this one luckily doesn't really have any broken necks, or else I would have trimmed off those as well. So then I will divide. This is probably what you would call a clump for most other ones. This one was just very large, so I've split it down to the 3 smaller ones. So I will find a vantage point to split it in half. If you can, try and split it in between the tubers. Sometimes you can't and you'll lose some, but this one, it's actually very good for dividing in half. So I usually just go straight down the center of the crown. Give it a little bit of a wiggle, because you can often just nudge it apart. Because sometimes the tubers can be done in layers. So like I've broken off that top section, and now that one I've broken, but that's okay. And then to go down the next layer, broke that one, but that's all right. So far I've got 2 good chunks. And then I would divide this one in half. This one is quite small and it looks a little bit damaged and it's a bit floppy. So personally I would chop that one off. And because it makes it easier to view underneath. So you could do this one in either way, 2 ways. Sometimes you can go by chopping little sections off at a time. Because see how this one's just attached in a little chunk? Or you could go by trying to divide the whole section in half and go from there. It depends how big you like your sections and how well or how competent you are in dividing. It's easier in different ways. And this one is a bit damaged, so the neck is all rotted. So I'm going to chop him off. And if you have any questions about this video, feel free to comment or message them. Hopefully you'll find this helpful. So with this clump, we have a few pretty good tubers. We've got this one at the side. We've got this one here, which is a little bit twisted with this one, but should come apart. And we have this one over at the side. So the way I would do it is firstly, I would chop the one off at the side. See, now it's got a good bit of that crown left. I would trim a little bit of that stem off, of that extra crown off, just because if you leave too much of the crown attached, it can invite rot, but that I would say is a good amount. And then I'm going to put my good tubers, I'll just clean a little space over here in the pile over here. And the next one is, so this can be a little bit tricky, but it's not too bad. So you've got a nice amount of space in between here. So I would just cut straight in half and then assess. So you've got that bit of crown in here. So I would just neaten off that. And then I usually give my tubers a little wiggle test on the neck, because sometimes they can look okay, but they can be bent or twisted underneath the covering. And you don't, for us, we try to send out quite high quality ones. So if they're already a bit bent or damaged, they're probably not going to be great by the time they get to the customer. So we would put that in our seconds basket, which my mum plants in the garden, or we give away to friends, or if they're very bent, we put them in the bin. Now this one is a bit twisted, but luckily the crowns are a bit separate. So you can, I'm gonna firstly trim off a bit of this section here, give a little bit of space, and then I'm going to divide it in half. And sometimes you'll just get bits that fling off, just the way the veins run in the tuber stems. But look, that's come apart quite nicely. And just give them all the bit of the wiggle test. And they look quite good. Just give that one a little bit of a neaten up. And when you're checking them, we always, see this is the inside of the stem and that's a little bit rotten. We will always cut that off, because that will always have the tendency to grow and not actually improve things. So we'll try as much as we can to get rid of any of that without getting too close and damaging it too much. because you still want to leave a good amount, because sometimes you can actually damage the cells that form the eyes on the other side. But that looks quite good. So now we've done one little clump. And this one, so if this one hadn't been bent, so that one's quite wobbly. So to be honest, I wouldn't trust that one. So I would chop that one off. But there, I can vaguely see an eye forming here and here. You could, if you were brave, chop that in half if that hadn't been bent. But personally, I would keep that together, and then I would wait until after storage to divide it, or that would be one I would potentially not ship or plant in the garden myself, just because sometimes if the tubers are awkwardly shaped, that means they might get damaged in shipping, and so it's just easier to plant the ones that are a bit more awkwardly shaped ourselves. And then we'll just trim off any rot. Yeah, so and then when I get a little bit of mess, I always keep a bin on the ground next to me, so I can just sweep the rubbish straight off the table and into the bin. So my favourite way is to work by, especially if you have a big clump, cut it down and work in small clumps. That is my best advice for anyone who's intimidated by tuber dividing. And if you're not sure about that division, leave it, and you can always divide it further come spring. It's because it's better to be safe than divide something and then you've destroyed the eyes. So, and if it doesn't have any of that crown, it's not going to grow. So there's no bother saving them. I tried saving a few of them because I'm like, it's going to grow my first year. And then I was very disappointed. So I learnt my lesson that even though I want to grow everything and keep everything, that sometimes you just can't save everything. So now I'm a bit more confident in my tuber splitting. But I think this is one of the skills that it just takes practice and practice. So with this one, we've got a very good crown. So we'll make that division there. Those ones are very close together, and those tuber necks are quite weak, so I would not divide that one. Trim that little bit off there, neaten that off. These snips have been well worn on. We've divided thousands of clumps with these snips this year. So they need a really, really good sharpen, not just a quick one, I think. But I think that tuber looks good. It looks a little bit rough, but that one will be perfectly fine come planting time. And then we just trim off. Oh, we got a little bug. And then this one. That one's a bit questionable. So to us, I would divide that one off, and I would probably chuck that in my seconds piles, to be honest. So this one, just cut around the eyes, really. So you've got this one. Trim off those little bits. They're not too bad. If you find it really difficult dividing the tuber clumps in half, like because the stems can sometimes be quite hard, a pair of loppers are sometimes handy. I don't particularly like that method, but if that works for you, I just find it's easier to shove a pair of long nose, pointy snips in, put it down the other side, and then just kind of wedge it apart. That's my favourite way to do it. Because this one is a little bendy and a little soft, I'm going to keep them together. You could separate them, but because they're both a little small, I think they'll do well together. Another thing about tubers is the bigger ones are not necessarily the better ones. Smaller tubers generally develop their own independent root systems faster, so you'll often get a more vigorous, healthy plant from the smaller tubers rather than the big ones, because the big ones rely completely on their own energy storage and stuff to grow and survive, and they don't develop their own independent root storage as fast. So if you get like any hot weather or if you get wind or anything, they just don't thrive as well sometimes. So the big ones will still do fine, but often the smaller ones can do a lot better. So if you get a small tuber, don't be stressed about the tuber size, because they will do fine. That would be perfectly fine. So this one's a little bit messy, so I've just cleaned up. Oh, there's a little tiny worm hiding in there. The good thing about our garden is we have lots of worms, but sometimes means you're picking lots of worms out of the tubers when you wash them and try and divide them. It's a good problem to have, I suppose. So with this one, it's a little bit damaged, so I will just leave a good amount of this crown and cut through the side here. So it's still got a good amount here. It's not probably one of my favourite tubers, but I think it will probably do fine. If you aren't happy with that one, you could put that in the seconds pile, which, to be honest, I would pop, if this was a variety I was going to sell. I've already got tons of this in my sale pile, so this is just for replanting at home. So I would probably plant this, but if I was selling this, I would probably, it would just go in the planting at home pile, which it is doing, so that's fine. And this one is a little bit, you can see how it's kind of rotten up near the crown, and then it's just snapped off, so that's not a particularly great one. We've got another little baby worm in there. Just get rid of him. And then we've got a nice crown here. And then you've got a good amount. Nice tuber there. So from just that little clump, got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 tubers. And I still have these 2 bigger ones to go. I won't divide those ones for you, but yeah, so the main processes for tuber division are, you need to make sure you have, if you're dividing when you can't see the eyes, make sure you have a healthy bit of crown, and always check for bent, snapped, broken stems. If we have broken roots, chop them off. It's not essential. If you have any rotten parts on your tubers, you need to chop them off to stop the rot spreading. We start by always divide the clumps in half, or in this case, because it was such a big one, we divide it into the separate little clumps. And then I like to divide by dividing it into the smaller chunks, make a pile of all my little clumps, and then I will divide down into the individual tubers and then go through and clean them up. I just personally, I like working in a process, and that's just my way of doing it. You'll find your own way of doing it. Some people just like smashing them with a shovel. If that works for you, works for you. Because we sell our tubers, we like to try and get as many tubers as we can safely, and while still sending out good quality ones. So we do try to divide them down into individual tubers. But yeah, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm Kirsten from Mount Joy Cottage, and we grow dahlias in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And yeah, if you have any questions, just let me know. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're interested, you can purchase the snips I was using and the sharpener on our website. They're my favourite snips for using in the garden and dividing tubers. I do sometimes use other ones if they're really hard, but personally I love the long pointy blade for just getting in the clump and getting in there and dividing. So yeah, I think that's all I've got to say for today. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.